Thank you very much for joining us today for the 11th edition of Book City. Hernan Diaz joining us from New York City, and I am Matteo Persivale from Corriere della Sera. Professor Diaz is a scholar of Jorge Luis Borges, and he's a teacher at Columbia in New York, has written one excellent book of criticism about Borges, and then two novels. His second novel, Trust, has been published in Italy by Feltrinelli with great critical acclaim. In America, is actually in the running for all the big literary prizes, which is very impressive in and by itself, since, again, Professor Diaz has only written two novels, neither of which looks like the novel of someone who's just starting out in the literary field, because the level of accomplishment and the level truly of simply they do not read like the debut novel and the second novel by someone is truly striking. So again, for Book City, I guess the first inevitable question was you truly seem to have come to literature already formed as a writer. Why do you think this happened? Do you think your background, your scholarship, your study as a critic, or simply your work, for example, about Borges, who by himself is sort of like a whole universe of literature contained in those tiny, incredibly rich books about everything that's ever happened and was ever written about. Do you think this might be part? I understand being your own critic is hard, even for a scholar. But again, I guess even the casual reader who picks up Trust and is not necessarily aware of how many books you've written before it, I don't think people would assume, unless they read, any material about yourself or your biography. This looks like, for its complexity, it really looks like the book written by, I don't know, a 70-year-old with 15 novels in his bibliography. Why do you think it works like that for you?
Well, thank you, Matteo, for your extremely generous introduction. I only wish we were together in person in Milan, a city I really, really love. But I'm stuck in Brooklyn. Well, and thank you for your thoughtful question. I think perhaps the premise of the question should be reconsidered. I don't consider myself as a newcomer to literature or to fiction, and I've been writing since I learned how to write. The only thing that happened to me was that nobody wanted to publish my stuff. It doesn't mean that there isn't a whole body of work there that remains somewhat invisible. But so, In the Distance, which is my first novel, is actually not my first novel. It's my first published novel, and so on and so forth. I have a bunch of short stories. I've always written criticism and essays. In short, I've been writing forever, and I'm not in my 70s, as you said, but I'm also not, sadly, in my 20s either. So all this to say that it's not, my work, however you want to judge it, is not a spontaneous thing that occurred overnight. I've been doing this for a very long time, and I think my career as a scholar has definitely informed my writing, mostly in two ways. I think it has exposed me to a big kind of literary territory that perhaps goes a little bit beyond what you are exposed to as a regular reader. When you're subjected to the discipline of academic reading, you read beyond your comfort zone, and that has definitely influenced me. And I think the second thing too, it has made me also unafraid of a certain tone in fiction that has to do with perhaps at times a slower pace, perhaps at time also considering certain I hope this doesn't sound too pompous, but certain philosophical or theoretical questions that I never present in an academic way, but they definitely inform the way in which I think about what I'm writing. So yeah, I suppose all of this is has informed who I am.
I guess one of the things that would make the casual reader assume that we are, dealing with a writer that truly has this very long experience, as you said, of not yet published or unpublished work, is really the Whartonian, as in Edith Wharton, first page of trust, because there's this voice, this narrator voice that's truly striking, that introduces us to Benjamin Rask, and this extraordinary figure, one of the world's richest men, and who managed to actually make money off of the 1929 Wall Street crash. And this is, we enter this world, and something that I will not do here is something that happened in your American reviews. I reviewed your novel for my paper, and I didn't want to spoil it. We have spoiler culture on the internet, which is not exactly what happens here, but let's just say that your novel has certain shifts, not really tonal shifts, but it's 4 novels in one. And I just wouldn't, I was very thank God I had read the novel already, but I've read some reviews where the entire structure and the mechanism that you devised was revealed, and I as a reader, I would have been disappointed by that, because again, the structure simply tells us that stories that we read about, especially the most powerful people in our society, it really depends on who's writing history, and it really depends on the point of view, and it really depends on what's the real story. There's a very beautiful sense of uncertainty as you progress, because you learn more, and the more you learn, the less your certainty about what you've read sort of starts to it's like a thread that becomes like threadbare in the end. So without really spoiling it for the readers who haven't had the opportunity to read the book already, really, I think this structure and the tonal shifts are one of the things that made the book the instant success with critics and audiences that it's been, and it's now. So would you like to discuss that?
Yeah, well, thank you. I think one of the key elements in the book is the notion of voice, and how we are really overly eager to trust certain kinds of voices, and think that they are immediately anchored and in truth, while we excuse other voices from having that relationship to truth. I think both of these things are highly questionable. And I think also at the core of the novel is this kind of evanescent line that separates history from fiction, which is a distinction that I'm very interested in. And I think that whenever we read any form of text, we enter into certain contracts with that text. Contracts that, again, have to do with the level of veracity that we are willing to assign to that text. And this level of veracity, I think, is the result of, first and foremost, of certain formal conventions. And when you have certain formal conventions that have precipitated and consolidated and ossified over time, what you get is a genre. So this is the thing that I was eager to explore in one of the things that I was eager to explore in the novel, how certain conventions, certain genre conventions, predispose us in a certain way toward what we're reading. So again, without any spoilers, for example, the first part out of the 4 parts of the book is a whole novel within the novel, which does indeed have a certain Whartonian or Jamesian tone. As you said, all these books here are Henry James behind me. So and it sort of keeps going for a while. And Wharton is on the other side. And so it's a novel within the novel, and we're supposed to take that as fiction. And then there is a very strong break leading to the second part, which is a historical document of sorts, and the reader quickly realizes that these are the real people on whom the novel they just read was based. So already you have this interaction between fiction and history, which, as I said a moment ago, is really one of the things that always concerns me, it seems, in my work for some reason or another.
Well, Between History and Eternity is, in
well,
fact,
there you go. Yeah,
the title of your Borges book.
Yeah,
So,
I hadn't thought of that. Thank you for pointing that out.
now, there's always this tension throughout the book, because, again, I'm very happy that you mentioned James yourself, because both James and Wharton seems to have done something that, as of late, American novelists really haven't done much, because the interest in
What is that? What did they do?
the most powerful country in the world, with the financial system and the richest man, you just don't see that much in contemporary literature, except for example, Louis Auchincloss, who was great about it. And when it comes to the power in Washington, at least, we have Gore Vidal as sort of like America's biographer. That's how he saw himself, at least. But generally speaking, one of the things that make your book so interesting and so special, I think, is that finally we see in the 20s of this century a writer, literally 100 years after Wharton, that's really interested in the people in New York who run the world, sort of.
Yeah, I think there is a difference, though. I mean, one could only hope to be compared to Edith Wharton. Like, she's such a colossus and such a towering presence in American letters and in my life as well. I have only admiration for her work. However, and same goes for Henry James, of course. However, I don't think either of them wrote specifically about money. I think their central concern was class, which is money adjacent, but it's not strictly about the inner workings of capital. And in her memoirs called A Backward Glance, which is a title that she borrowed from Walt Whitman, Edith Wharton actually talks about her friend Henry James and said that, the American moneymaker in action, I think is the phrase she uses, the American moneymaker in action always eluded him. And that he was unable to write about Wall Street. He was unable to write about the place of money in American society. I think this is true. James did indeed not do that. And there are a few financiers in Wharton's novels, but that just happens to be their profession. But we don't get a glimpse into any of that. The same goes for other books in the American canon that we take to be about money, like, I don't know, for instance, The Great Gatsby, which is a book that I have a ton of issues with, but money is really not a part of that. We're not privy to the money making in Gatsby. Nick, the narrator, defines himself as a bondsman, so we know he trades in bonds, but that's pretty much all we know. And then if you really want to fast forward and think of books like, I don't know, Bret Easton Ellis's American Psycho, which again is about someone who is in mergers and acquisitions, or but again, we never really know what Patrick Bateman does. I get that is partially the point of that book, but still, I mean, and this was something that really awakened my curiosity and drove me in part to write this particular book, because even though money plays this outsized role in the United States and the way in which this country imagines itself, when you look at the American canon, there are very few novels about money making. Upton Sinclair has one. Theodore Dreiser has 3. It's a trilogy. But the really, really precious few books that deal with money making. It seems that in American fiction, all the money is already made.
Yeah.
But the process of the making remains under covers.
Yeah, because again, unless you mentioned American Psycho, which is satire, and Tom Wolfe, even if he seemed to personally like the financial system in itself, he really creates this satire, which is mostly about New York, because Sherman McCoy, he's not really making fun of the way McCoy makes money, of the way or the way his investment bank operates. He makes fun about everything around him and how
exactly
that's right, target for destruction once a huge machinery gets moving. But again, there seems to be on the one hand in literature the potential for satire, and also cinema seems in a way to be more interested in it, because it's pop culture, but still, Succession is a huge hit on television, and it's basically, quote unquote, it's inspired by the Murdoch family. I mean, it's been written.
But again, I think that's a media. It's more about media than it is about money, and money as obviously the revenue that this media empire produces. But I don't think the central focus of the show is actually capital. Again, I think you will be very, very hard pressed to, and we can talk for an hour and find little examples that may satisfy us to a greater or lesser degree. But my point is that in a culture so defined by capital as the American culture, wouldn't you think that it would be very easy for us to produce a long list instantly of novels and films and shows that deal with this in a very direct, frontal way? wouldn't that be the natural thing? And yet that, that body of work, that canon, is simply not there. So this to me speaks of a certain kind of ideological issue around the theme, and it's something that can only be glanced at, sort of diagonally and never directly. So that to me was very interesting.
Maybe novelists in general, American novelists, live in a culture where that would be too close to journalism. That would be too much like naturalism and like a realist. Because again, it's a perfect target for satire. But what you do here, which is again, try to explain to us why this mythology of the what we would now call the robber baron, how this mythology has been created, and how, as you mentioned, different point of view explain to you how there's always a mythopoietic process. It's always going on, like it's a novel in and by itself, and there's the real person behind it, and the way you end your novel, again, not to spoil it, but there's a truly like a Thomas Mann atmosphere at the end that truly breaks your heart. And again, it's something very very rare, I think, in American literature in general. There's something you mentioned. Now I'm curious about your issues with The Great Gatsby, because as Italians, we've been raised, when it comes to American literature, we've been raised on Fitzgerald and Hemingway mostly as these two gods. Maybe Faulkner just a tiny bit less for Italians, as opposed to his status in America. But truly, Fitzgerald and Hemingway have been our gods of American literature of the 20th century. What are your issues with The Great Gatsby? I'm just curious.
I'm a little reticent to go too much into it, but I think one of the, and also it may be just because I've been inhabiting this world, which is kind of Gatsby adjacent, so I have very strong opinions. It could just be that. But when I started writing Trust, to me, one of the first constraints or rules that I set for myself, or a red flag that I was waving in front of myself, was that I didn't want to write a novel about extreme wealth that ended up beguiled and dazzled and fascinated by the very thing that it had set out to critique.
Yeah.
And I think this is something that definitely happens in Gatsby. We're supposed to be given, and in a lot of Fitzgerald, we're supposed to be given these scathing critiques of inequality, excess, and unbridled eccentric wealth. But at least this reader always feels a sense of fascination for that, and to me it falls short in that regard politically. I'm also not a big fan of like the prose. I'm also not a big fan of the mechanics of that novel, plot wise, and how it's built on just, it's a big Deus ex machina, the denouement of the novel, with the switched cars, the gas station. It's just a little hilarious to me, that book. But that's just my opinion. It's totally relevant. This is my opinion as a reader. I don't claim that any of this is objective. It's just how I feel. I'd rather not be reading Fitzgerald at any time of the day.
Now you need to do Hemingway, though, because
oh no, let's not do the whole snark fest. I don't know enough about Hemingway. I don't know. It doesn't it's a kind of macho prose that has never really spoken to me, honestly. So I like his short stories. Some of them I really like.
Which American writers were you most interested in when you were growing up, and which American novelists would you name as your sort of like your pantheon of American
Oh
literature?
dear, so many. I mean, the list is endless. But since you said when I was growing up, I think very early on, the discovery of Edgar Allan Poe to me was very, very important, and that whole world. And also, talk about an author who had so many registers, so many textures. He invented detective fiction in 1846 or 48. He, according to some scholars, may have invented science fiction. Although I want to give Mary Shelley that credit. But in the bibliography, some argue for Poe, and then he has these insane mystical writings, and he has beautiful poetry, and a massive influence in Baudelaire and the symbolists, and he's just this incredible, towering presence in Western letters beyond the United States. So he was one of the first authors I read. I think, well, James I started reading in my late teens, and I'm still reading him. We already talked about Edith Wharton. Herman Melville is massively important to me. I've read most of his books. Closer to the present, writers like David Markson are very important to me. Joy Williams, I read every line she publishes. I don't know. It's it would be a really long list. I read mostly American literature, so that is my sort of natural habitat.
It's interesting that you mentioned Markson, because he's great, obviously, and he's distinctive for his progressive sort of skepticism toward classic narrative
Of
devices.
course.
At the end of his career, his novels are about this novelist who quotes certain, for those who haven't read him, because I don't think David Markson has been extensively translated into Italian, unfortunately.
I'm sure he
Wittgenstein's
hasn't. Yeah.
Wittgenstein's Mistress must have been translated, I think, but not much. Anyway, he seems to have sort of maybe lost faith in how the classic 19th century structure of the novel could bring across meaning. Is it something you find interesting or relevant for yourself, or are you simply just...
Well, I just listed him among my favorite writers ever, so obviously this is something that speaks to me, and I think that David Markson is probably one of the people I reread the most. I go back to him. I think that skepticism, and maybe we shouldn't go too deeply into this, because as you said, I think he has a very small readership, and most of it may not be translated into Italian. But I think, just maybe to wrap it up about Markson, I think that skepticism was always there. When if you read earlier work, and these kind of it's these pastiche novels, mimicking a Western or a noir, I think there was always a distance. There was never sort of a deep sort of mimetic investment in the 19th century way that you just mentioned. I don't think he was ever that kind of writer, but I think there was a tendency toward, for lack of a better word, abstraction in especially in his four note card novels, as they're known, his four last books. And I actually, you mentioned the last section of Trust, the final section, you know, I was thinking a lot about David Markson writing it, and it's obvious when you just look at the layout of my
Yeah.
pages. You know, there is a deep influence there that I have no problem confessing to, because I love his work.
No, as I mentioned, the sense that the narrative is getting threadbare. You know, there are threads that are just dissolving. I think are extremely interesting. Well, to wrap up this conversation, since Book City is truly about genre this year, the whole idea would be you chose to not to, you know, it's not the first novel you write, but you know, the first novel you published is about the American West.
Yes.
And again, as a reader, one would imagine, you know, Cormac McCarthy, you know, and then it's not. You start reading Trust, and you're like, okay, this is Wharton. You know, I know where we're going, and you really take pride in always trying to change the really to shift the way the reader approaches your work.
Mm.
So this sort of trust in the pardon my pun, but this trust in the attention of the reader in this incredibly attention critical and attention deprived era, I really think is something that makes your work so interesting,
Well,
because
thank you.
you always assume the reader is going to follow something that it's not necessarily evident, and
Yeah.
this process of discovery this is something you obviously set out to do from the very beginning.
Yeah.
And if you'd like to discuss this for a second, how
Yeah.
so.
Well, look, the first thing that I would like to say is, and thank you for noticing the trust that I place in the reader, because I really do. I always, I don't believe in an ideal reader or any of that. I think that's a boring conversation to even, you know, I'm sorry I brought it up, but whenever I imagine a reader, I always assume they will be way more intelligent than I am. That is always like, I'm assuming I am the idiot in this transaction. I'm assuming the other person will always be ahead of me, will have better taste than I do, and will have read much more widely than I have. This is the kind of misty presence that I have in my mind when I'm writing. But this also means that I can allow myself, because I assume that everyone has read everything, right? So that allows me to work with certain commonplaces, cliches, and again, sets of expectations that always make up the horizon event of what a genre is. I think a genre could be, you know, quickly defined as a system of expectations. You know, you know, in a fairy tale, you expect magic to have a role in the resolution of the plot. You do not expect that in a noir novel. You know, you expect that there will be a certain element of deduction and physical harm and you know, social anxiety, which again you don't expect in the fairy tale, and so on and so forth. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious what I'm saying. But what I like to do in my work is to take all these expectations and sort of invite the reader to invest in them, and then, as far as I can, try to do some sort of judo move with the weight, with the acquired weight of these expectations, and turn them upside down. And I think, but I don't mean that as manipulatively or as a like a, you know, as a power play or anything. it's something that I enjoy too as a reader, when that is done to me, when I'm led gently into a world whose loss I think I understand, and then suddenly everything shifts. That is very gratifying to me as an aesthetic literary experience, and I try to provide that experience to my readers.
Professor Diaz, again, thank you so very much for taking the time to talk to us. And again, for the 11th edition of Book City, I really appreciate your talk. Thank you so
Matteo,
much.
you are the best. You've been very generous with my work and by reading it with so much attention. And I'm very grateful for this amazing conversation. Hope to see you in person soon again.
Again, I really hope I can see you soon. Please come visit.
Okay.